Actraiser spun its way down from the heavens and onto your Super NES back in 1990 and was one of the very first action games released for the system. Actraiser was developed by Quintet and published by Enix and was their own personal take on the Christian faith. With the game featuring gods, devils, and angels aplenty, you'd think they wanted to create some sort of god game with their action side-scrolling game. And, well, they basically did, as Actraiser also features a complete city-building sim in the game as well. So was this unholy marriage of action game and god game worth your time when the Super NES came out? Or were the two genres never meant to be paired together? Well, get comfy in your favorite floating palace, because we're about to see if Actraiser buckles under the weight. Start up Actraiser and you're immediately made to name your character, and then get a basic summary of why you're about to do what you're gonna do in Actraiser. Essentially, you play the role of God, though you're called the Master in the US version of the game. And it's your job to clean up the world after being asleep long enough for monsters and devils to invade everything. After the weird baby angel's done telling you your own backstory, you'll be left with a menu that lets you move around the map in your super cool god ship if you want to get a lay of the land below or choose to go down to Earth and do battle. Just be sure you're actually over the part of the map that the game wants you to go down to, or you'll probably be confused as to why the game isn't letting you do anything. Get in position and you're treated to some obligatory Mode 7 scaling down to the ground, and then it's time to do some battle. Actraiser's side-scrolling levels are pretty standard. Your character has a sword to swing at the various enemies populating the map and a jump to get around with. Beyond that, you'll eventually get some magic powers to use, but overall, this is as basic as you can get. That's generally okay though, since the game has really great control, and the stages are all varied enough to make things feel fresh every time you go down to a new stage. Sadly though, none of the stages are honestly all that hard, and only take a couple of deaths to memorize everything in them. This carries over to the bosses as well. While they can generally look large and intimidating, their patterns are easily picked up on and can be killed off in a couple of tries if you're paying attention to them at all. The side-scrolling stages do at least benefit from some really nice graphics for just how early a Super NES game this was, and it impressed with large sprites, even though any of them barely animated beyond 3 frames of animation. Still though, the side-scrolling action stages move at a fast enough pace that kept things fun, and never really overstayed their welcome. Once you beat the first boss, Actraiser returns to its overhead perspective, and this is where things get weird. Suddenly, Actraiser decides it wants to be a city-building game, a la SimCity. No, Actraiser isn't just a side-scrolling action game. In fact, most of the time you'll be playing Actraiser, you'll be managing and building your cities in between the action stages. Basically, your subjects will let you know what they need you to do for them to create a thriving city once again, and then it's up to you to do it for them. Mostly you'll be clearing out obstacles using your various miracles like lightning and earthquakes, and then telling your villagers which direction to build in. Building in the right direction is important, as you and your subjects will constantly be getting attacked from various monsters that spawn out of portals around the map. Building the city in the direction of those portals will allow the people to eventually attack and destroy them once they get close enough. Along the way, at various times, you'll be called back into meetings and be given gifts and directed where to go next, and eventually revealing where the big bad guy is currently residing so you can get back into the action stages. Defeat the main boss of the land and you've basically beat stage 1, so it's time to move on to the next town that needs help and do it all over again. You can always go back to previous towns that don't require your help anymore to continue building it up, but you really don't get anything more out of it besides knowing you're creating an awesome place for them to live in. So just keep moving forward to new towns so you can continue to open up new areas to build and stages to hack away in. Now you'd think that dividing Actraiser up into what's essentially 2 separate games would just be a giant mess. Surprisingly though, Actraiser's really fun and addicting, with very few issues all around. The city building stages all move at a super fast pace and fit in surprisingly well with the rest of the game. Building up city populations and achieving the various goals in them feels almost like a fun diversion from the action stages, never feeling like a chore or a waste of time while you're itching to get back into killing bad guys with a sword. About the worst problem the game has is that damn naked baby angel that's constantly explaining everything to you every single time you select it. Also, the interruptions by the townspeople can sometimes get annoying as well. You could also bash the side-scrolling levels for sometimes being overly short and easy, but overall, you're looking at a damn near perfect merging of two separate genres of games, and that's really impressive. Still though, if you find yourself instantly losing interest at the idea of a city-building game all up in your action side-scrolling game, then Actraiser may not be for you. Personally though, this was an all-time favorite game of mine, and actually introduced me to the concept of a city-building sim. The overall package of Actraiser is really hard to complain about, even today. The graphics, music, and simple but fun gameplay are all amazingly well done throughout, and you even get a surprisingly good plot dealing with religion that few games have ever been able to do since. So if you're interested at all in any of this, then by all means find a copy of Actraiser and give it a try. It deserves it just for the sheer ambition of the game, and it'll probably hook you before you know it. Clay Fighter busted out of the circus and onto your Super NES back in 1993, and was one of the very first games to feature the art of claymation as one of its big selling points. Developed by Visual Concepts, yes, the very same Visual Concepts that would later go on to make the 2K series of sports games, and published by Interplay, Clay Fighter was positioned as a less serious entry into the now burgeoning fighting game genre. While other games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat were busy duking it out for fighting game supremacy, Clay Fighter was trying to take a more humorous approach with their game. So did Clay Fighter succeed in being a great alternative choice for fighting game fans? Or was it relegated to that dark part of the circus tent that no one wants to go to because it's all damp and smells weird? Well, slather yourself with your favorite clay, because we're about to see if Clay Fighter melts underneath the spotlight. Start up Clay Fighter and you're treated to what has to be one of the more cringe-worthy opening theme songs ever made for a game. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's cool that there's even a theme song in the game at all, but man is that bad. Press the start button and you'll eventually make it to the character select screen where you get your first taste of Clay Fighter's unique roster. Filled with such timeless warriors as a snowman and a clown that appears to have been ravaged by years of meth addiction, your first big challenge in Clay Fighter is just trying to settle on which one of these guys or things to represent you in the game. Yes, again, I get it, Clay Fighter's supposed to be goofy and crazy and all these characters come from the circus and so on, but even as a kid playing this, I wasn't finding this mishmash of bad stereotypes and reject Saturday morning cartoon characters funny in the least. Still though, you're gonna have to pick one if you want to continue, so just choose the character or thing that makes you the least uncomfortable, and then get ready for even more wacky fun. Once you're into the fighting itself, you'll quickly see that this is yet another fighting game trying its best to imitate the gameplay of Street Fighter 2, just with all that whole aforementioned wackiness thrown in as the main differentiator. You get 3 punch buttons and 3 kick buttons, which is honestly about 5 too many buttons for what Clay Fighter's trying to do here, since it's obviously not trying to be some super deep fighting game. Instead, Clay Fighter focuses on weird and zany attacks and special moves to throw at your opponents, in the hopes that stuff like that will disguise the fact that this isn't a very good fighting game. Everything feels like it's in slow motion a lot of the time, and even just landing a hit feels off, like it didn't register or something. Special attacks require a strange amount of precision to pull off, which is weird for a game trying to focus on being simple and fun. And while it may be fun to see what weird each character's special attacks do, it doesn't keep your attention for very long. And what you're left with is a slow, clunky fighting game that really has nothing going for it besides the whole Clay characters trying to be funny thing. And even saying it has that going for it is a bit of a stretch. Yes, if you couldn't tell, the whole gimmick of Clay Fighter is the Clay characters and backgrounds. Every character was at one point handmade and animated, resulting in the digitized look of the characters. And while this could have been really neat, Clay Fighter somehow manages to mess up the one thing it tried so hard to nail. First off, the characters are animated horribly, instantly losing whatever cool hand-animated look it could have had. Everything you do with a character seems overly choppy, which doesn't help the already bad controls. And I already touched on just how bad the character designs are, but I feel it's worth mentioning again because good God are they bad. You know you're getting into something special when an angry snowman is the most compelling character in the entire game. The rest of the characters circle the toilet of bad design choices, culminating with a boss that's literally just a spinning circle with googly eyes on him. The rest of the game looks just as bad, with backgrounds so ugly and uninteresting that it somehow manages to make the characters themselves look okay. It's really sad too, since Clay Fighter could have genuinely been a striking game with better art design and direction. Instead, we're left with the equivalent of a giant clay turd of a game. On the surface, Clay Fighter is a pretty great idea. A less serious fighting game intended for a younger audience or people that were getting tired of the fighting game genre as a whole. Clay Fighter was pushing for just that and relished in the idea of being the anti-fighting game, with ads making fun of Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter in just about every gaming magazine that you could find at the time. It was meant to be lighthearted fun, and for the most part, I think they had a great blueprint to do just that. I know a lot of people to this day that still genuinely love Clay Fighter. Unfortunately for me, the execution just isn't there. The characters are all uniformly awful, the gameplay is slow and generic, and even the whole Clay aesthetic gets lost in one of the more aggressively ugly games ever made for the Super NES and Genesis. Still though, if you've got a friend around and enough alcohol, you could maybe get a few rounds of fun out of Clay Fighter. Just don't expect anything more from it. The rest of us should probably just send these circus freaks back to the unemployment line once and for all. Aladdin exploded out of its lamp and onto your Sega Genesis back in 1993 and was an instant stunner the second anyone laid eyes on it. Developed by Virgin Games USA and published by Sega, Aladdin for the Genesis is based on the incredibly popular Disney movie of the same name that came out a year before. Using a brand new process called Digicel technology, it promised to bring the movie home in video game form like never before. It was also a 16-bit exclusive for the Genesis, as Capcom was already hard at work on the Super NES version of Aladdin, which was a completely different game. So did Aladdin on the Genesis go a long way in making all of us Super NES players jealous? Or was this yet another example of a movie to video game port that was filled with nothing but disappointment? Well, grab your favorite mystical lamp, because we're about to see if Aladdin for the Genesis was worth wishing for. Start up Aladdin and you'll immediately notice the game's biggest selling point, the graphics and animation. Yes, everything you see in Aladdin was originally hand-drawn and animated, and then painstakingly converted into the game's sprites using Virgin's new Digicel technology. Essentially, what it did was made the act of transferring actual art into the game an easier process than doing it by hand, which is why every character in the game has really great animation, especially for a 16-bit game. Even the game's lowliest enemies and characters ooze detail and style that was rarely seen back then, thanks to everything being hand-animated first. And even though the Genesis couldn't reproduce the rich colors that the Super NES could, you'd be hard-pressed to tell in Aladdin, as all the stages and characters used the Genesis color palette to its fullest, making for an incredibly bright and colorful game that would look great on just about any console. To say that the graphics in Aladdin wowed anyone that saw it would be an understatement, and it's still one of the best-looking Genesis games to this day. Once you get past those stunning graphics though, it's probably best to learn how to actually play the game. Aladdin follows the same tried and true platform blueprint of most games of the time, so expect to be doing a good bit of jumping around stages while killing and avoiding enemies on the way to the exit. Aladdin himself uses a scimitar for close range attacks and apples you collect for longer range attack that keeps you out of the face of enemies. Beyond that, you can pick up a few things throughout each stage to help you along, like screen clearing power-ups and the always helpful extra life. If you search hard enough, you'll also find power-ups that let you access bonus stages after you complete the stage, which allow you to build up even more extra lives to help you make it through the game. The stages themselves are all generally based on scenes and setting from the movie, with a few areas added in for some variety. Most are more maze-like in design than just a straightforward platform game, but it's generally never too hard to figure out where you need to go with a bit of exploring. Overall, it's an inoffensive recipe that should have worked well for Aladdin, the key word there being should have. Yes, for as amazing as Aladdin looks, it unfortunately comes at the cost of gameplay. Those stunning animations are all incredibly fluid, but they make the act of doing anything in Aladdin feel just kinda weird. For instance, swinging your sword takes far too long to actually get to the point where it'll hurt an enemy, resulting in you taking a hit while the animation is winding up. This also affects jumping as well, as Aladdin's jump animation can sometimes make it hard to tell where you'll land on a platform, producing more than a fair amount of over or under jumping your target. And with a game this focused on some pretty exact platforming in spots, it can really get annoying. Even just running around feels a bit too weighty and slippery, making running straight into enemies or falling off ledges a common occurrence. Aladdin's also one of those games where it just seems like you're taking damage constantly, no matter how well you think you're playing. Enemies and projectiles seem to come from just about everywhere, with only a second's notice to react, making that animation even more bothersome as you take yet another hit from some random thing because Aladdin wouldn't react fast enough. And while Aladdin isn't unplayable by any means, there are just too many times when the controls and animation get in the way of what should have been an awesome game. Still though, even with the control issues, Aladdin is a must-play if you're a fan of the movie. Few games have ever represented the movie they're based off of better than Aladdin for the Genesis does. This certainly isn't one of the dozens of terrible movie-to-video game ports that littered clearance bins back in the day, as Aladdin actually accomplished what so many other movie-to-games tried and failed miserably at, which is finally making you feel like you were playing the movie come to life in video game form. And that was generally more than enough to power past whatever issues this game has. So if you're at all a fan of the movie, go hunt yourself down a copy of Aladdin for the Sega Genesis. It's one of the very few licensed games out there that won't leave you wishing for more. Castlevania rose from its grave and onto your NES back in 1986, and it's Castlevania. If you guys don't know what Castlevania is yet, then, well, I truly feel for you. If not, then don't fret, as we'll do our best to explain why Castlevania is considered to be one of the greatest games of all time, and easily one of the best games ever released on the NES. So grab your favorite whip and cross, because we're about to see if Dracula and his minions can stand up to modern-day scrutiny. Start up Castlevania and you're greeted to one of the all-time classic openings to a game, as Simon Belmont approaches Dracula's castle for the very first time, ready to take on anything that Dracula has to throw at him. After a quick walk up to the castle gate and collecting a few power-ups along the way, you enter the castle to the first stage of the game, and this is where you'll come to grips with controlling Simon. As you probably expect from an early NES game, the controls are incredibly simple to learn. The A button jumps, while the B button swings your whip at anything in front of you, and that's mostly it. The only other thing you can do is use whatever special weapon you've picked up by pressing up and attack at the same time. Get those fundamentals down and you should be able to tackle just about anything Castlevania has to throw at you. And yes, Castlevania is going to throw a lot at you. From ghosts to fire-breathing dragon skulls, the monsters you'll face off with in Castlevania will be coming at you at a near constant pace as you explore the castle. The enemies in Castlevania are as relentless as they are ugly, and you'll have to learn each one's patterns and attacks intimately to get past them without taking damage. The simplest of which will just be enemies running straight at you in the hopes that I guess you don't see them or something. Others mix things up a little bit by throwing axes at you, or by spasming all over the place, making it hard to get a hit on them. And of course you can't talk about a Castlevania game without mentioning those godforsaken Medusa heads that continuously fly all over the screen at you in the most annoying patterns ever. Get past all those guys though and you'll be rewarded a boss at the end of each stage to deal with, and while they may look large and easy to hit, you'll probably find yourself getting slammed by all the crap that they're throwing at you. Keep at it though and you should be able to take them down without too many curse words shouted at the TV. Beat the boss and it's time to pull out the map to see where you're going next, and then it's on to the next stage to do it all over again. As you make your way through the depths of Dracula's castle, you'll come across a few things that'll help you deal with the constant barrage of enemies coming at your face, including a nice assortment of power-ups you find hidden in various candles in each stage. I mean, I guess if you're gonna hide a weapon, then a candle's as good a place as any. The first thing you'll need to start powering up is your whip's attack and length by collecting whip power-ups. At first your whip looks like a wet spaghetti noodle with barely any reach at all, but collect 3 power-ups and you've got a much more powerful whip that can cover a lot more distance. Keeping your whip powered up is hugely important, since it can mow down most monsters and bosses without too much effort at its most powerful state. But if you die, then you're stuck back with that spaghetti noodle again until you can find more power-ups, and that can make the game even harder than it already is. Besides the whip power-ups, you'll also find the aforementioned special weapons that effectively give you a second weapon to throw at enemies. Some are self-explanatory like the axe and the dagger, while others like the stopwatch offer up alternative ways to get past frustrating parts of the game. But don't just go around throwing them at everything, as you can only use them if you've collected enough hearts along the way. These effectively act as your special weapon ammo, so try to keep them around for when you need them most, like stages that are a real pain in the ass or bosses. You can also find a few other things that are lying around to help you as well, like the screen clearing cross and the ever famous turkey hidden in a wall to recover some of your health, but that's generally all the help the game's gonna give you. The rest is gonna be left entirely up to you to get through, and trust me, it ain't gonna be easy. Yes, Castlevania is hard, really hard. Once you manage to beat that first boss, the training wheels come off, and Castlevania turns into one of the most challenging games released on the NES at the time. You'll quickly find yourself dealing with pixel-perfect jumps, enemies with incredibly cheap patterns, and bosses that can decimate you in just a few seconds. And if it's your first time playing the game, expect countless game over screens, as Castlevania will show no mercy through any of its 6 nightmarish levels. If you're determined to see it through to the end and take down Dracula, then get ready for hours of controller tossing and screaming at the TV. But honestly, the challenge is actually one of Castlevania's best qualities, since it's the kind of challenge that constantly makes you want to keep trying over and over again. While the game can certainly be cheap at times, it's never enough to make you want to give up completely. Few games have ever done difficulty this well, and not even Castlevania's own sequels could match the just one more try mentality that this game has. Finally beating a stage after dozens of tries offers up a level of satisfaction that few games have ever matched. So yeah, Castlevania may be hard, but it's hard in the best ways possible. And while you may be playing each stage over and over due to that difficulty, you'll at least be treated to some of the best graphics and music the NES has ever offered up. The game may obviously be simplistic looking, but its iconic settings, enemies, and bosses make each stage feel like a unique place in the castle. You'll go from basic hallways to the very depths of the castle on your trip through it, and they all look great. You also get treated to one of the best soundtracks ever composed for a game as you play, making those constant deaths just a little bit easier to swallow. Obviously, there's very little you could complain about with Castlevania, but if you're anal enough, like us, you could probably find a few problems here and there to bitch about. I know, how dare I criticize one of the finest NES games ever put onto a cartridge? Well, maybe it's because I spent so much time playing it as a kid that I've certainly got a few pet peeves that stretch across all games, because they originated in Castlevania. For one, getting knocked back when you get hit is the one thing you can put in your game now if you want me to instantly put the controller down and walk away. In fact, I'd wager that well over 50% of my deaths in this game are due to that stupid knockback, and it's never been easy to swallow, especially since it always manages to knock you off the ledge at the worst possible time. Besides that, you could say that Simon's jump is way too heavy feeling, since he seems to stop about halfway and then just sort of floats there for a second. It's definitely weird, but you eventually get used to it. Those complaints are also minor to the overall package though, that it really just kind of comes off sounding like we're whining about things, because Castlevania is basically near perfect in just about everything it does. And the fact that this was the first game ever released in the series makes it even more impressive. There's little question that all of us here at Retrovania love Castlevania. For me personally, Castlevania was the very first NES game I owned as a kid, and it's provided hundreds and hundreds of hours of fun ever since then. It single-handedly shaped what I expected a game to be from there on out. Obviously inspires more than a few things on this very channel. So if you've somehow never played Castlevania, I don't know what you're waiting for then. This is one of the first games you play instantly if you're at all interested in playing classic video games. It may be hard as nails, but I can safely say that every second spent yelling and cursing at the screen is worth it to experience the reason that a lot of us got hooked on video games in the first place. And it's obviously just as much fun to play these days as it was back in 1986. So go grab a copy of Castlevania for yourself, since there's never been a better time to put Dracula back in his coffin for the first time, or the 500th time.